Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D RPG about a marine biologist trying to save the ocean and its inhabitants. Today is Monday, January 10th. It's just after 8 p.m., which is a pretty unusual time for me to start a devlog, but I want to try something a little bit different with this episode. As this channel's grown over the years and I've tried to improve the quality of these devlogs, I've typically held off on filming them unless I had some new really interesting piece of functionality to build in the coming week. That's what I did with the last video as I started working on the skill system, which was a really cool piece of functionality and made for a great devlog. But I've also found that this practice can have some negative effects. Most importantly, if I don't feel like I have the time or energy to film one day, sometimes I'll delay some work that I should be doing that I think would actually make for some interesting content once I do have the energy to film. And apart from that, only filming the most glamorous tasks means I'm sharing less of this journey with you all, and I really think all of it's important, not just the flashy new features. So with that said, this week I think I'm just going to wing it. Back to this channel's roots, I'll bring you along as I grind away on Dauphin this week, whether it's squashing bugs or writing new code, and try to show you how I attempt to make time for all of it alongside my 9 to 5 and everything else. After recording this intro, it is now 8:30. I try to keep bedtime at 9:30 sharp, and I also try to not necessarily sit at my computer all the way up until that point. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll try to pull some low-hanging fruit off my defect list. The most interesting defect for me tonight is this one that I've recently created down here at the bottom, which is related to the vignette effect that happens when the player is underwater and their air supply is timing out. Specifically, after that timeout occurs and the vignette closes, it does not reset if you go back underneath the water. Should be a pretty simple change within the diving state, so I'm going to see if I can knock that out. While I'm working on that, I want to provide a quick update on my Patreon page. I've recently added a new tier of support and a new benefit for every tier, which will be a private Discord channel where I'll post less formal, more frequent updates on my development progress. And on top of that, I've got a fun little bonus for the next few weeks. Until this is no longer practical, if you join up on Patreon, you will be sponsoring a new shrimp for my aquarium. I'm sure many of you have noticed that as of a few months ago, my 10-gallon aquarium that I've been showing on this channel for years at this point looks totally different. It needed a complete refresh, so that's what it got. To act as a temporary home for its longtime inhabitants during the rebuild, I set up this great little 5-gallon tank on my new desk. It has served its job perfectly. All my shrimp and my sparkling gourami buddies thoroughly enjoyed their stay in this little hotel, and I'm almost done moving them back home to the 10-gallon. Once I do, that will leave this tank on my desk completely empty, and I'd love to build up a thriving colony of shrimp in here, maybe of an exotic color if my local fish store comes through. If you do sponsor a shrimp, I'll show its release in a future devlog and give you a shout out. Of course, regardless of my Patreon page and all of this, I'm just super grateful to have y'all here with me on the channel. So thanks for watching as always, and let's get back to the devlog. Alright, thankfully that fix was pretty straightforward. Our player has a dive state, and when we open that up, we'll see that our dive state has a child called the dive vignette. This is a canvas layer that ultimately manages that shader effect of the vignette closing in on the player. If we open up that script, you'll see that we're kind of modifying the shader here, but what we weren't doing is ever resetting the parameters of that shader. Might have expected that to happen automatically if this scene was deallocated from memory and then created anew every time we went underwater, but because this is ultimately a kind of great grandchild of the player node, which never gets deallocated when we move it between scenes, that was never happening. So instead of relying on this new initialization to reset those parameters, I'm now relying on exit tree, which is called when this node exits the tree, which happens when the player moves between scenes. So all I had to do was write a few lines here to reset that shader effect, and we're good to go. Just after 9 p.m. now, so probably time to start winding down. Tomorrow's lifting day for me, so my morning will start out in the garage, but after that I should have an hour or so before work to make some more progress on the skill system. We'll catch up then. Morning everyone, back at the desk just after 7 a.m. here following a brutally cold workout and my Wim Hof breathing practice. Even though I have a meeting at 9 a.m. that I'll need to do some prep for this morning, I still have a generous development window, so I'll be looking to work on something a bit more substantive than a defect. One of my remaining tasks for my skill system is what I'm calling individual skill details, and really what I mean by this is just the individual pieces of content that you can unlock by leveling up each individual skill. So I think this content is going to be built out kind of organically as I continue to develop Dauphin, But what I would like to have in place now is a predefined pattern for potentially locking a piece of content behind a skill that has too low of a level. I think the dive skill will be a great candidate for a proof of concept here. Since I can already actually perform the basic actions of diving and track the depth, I know that one of the things I want to have locked behind your diving skill is how deep you can dive. So as a proof of concept, I can try and maybe limit the player to diving no deeper than about 5 meters until you're at least level 2 or 3 or something like that. Alright, I'm going to jump in. Hopefully we will have time to catch up before work today. Alright, checking in here at 8:15 this morning with some decent progress on what I'm calling skill unlocks. So if we open up our field notes and head to the skills page, and for this example specifically select the diving skill, you'll notice that below the progress bar we now have 2 rows for the first 2 unlocks of this skill. At level 1, or basically by default, you've unlocked depth 1, and at level 2 you will unlock depth 2. These are just placeholders, but hopefully you can get the idea of what we're going for here. If you hover your mouse over the name of that unlock, it'll give you some more information. So by default, with depth 1, you can dive up to 5 meters deep. When you reach level 2, you'll be able to dive up to 10 meters deep with the depth 2 unlock. To get to this point in the UI, I follow the same pattern that I always have for my field notes. Down here in the bottom left in my file system, you can see that we have the player folder open here, and that player has a folder called skills where each of his skills are stored. In our case, we were just modifying the diving skill. So if we go ahead and click on that diving skill resource, over here on the right, you'll see that we have a new element here in our inspector, and this is an array called unlocks. This is obviously a variable size array that I can fill up with any specific unlocks that I want to be associated with this skill. In this case, or really in every case, these unlocks will also be their own individual resources. And if we go back to the file system, you can see that I have a subfolder within diving to store these unlocks. The skill unlock resource itself is dead simple. Probably the most important field here is the unlock level, which we will use to check if the player can actually complete the actions associated with this unlock, as well as some things to help out with the UI, like the name, description, and the message, which we will end up showing the player once they achieve the level required for this unlock. What's nice about keeping this in a resource and attaching this to the player's skill in that array is that when the player tries to actually do something associated with this skill and its unlocks, I'll be able to look at this list of unlocks and determine if the player is actually allowed to access that content. Back on the skill detail page, you will notice that by default it is still empty. Like all other pages in my field notes, what I'm actually doing is just providing this page with the data it needs to populate itself and letting it do that programmatically. So here in my populate skill data function, you can see where we were already populating the name and the experience bar view, but now we have a section here for unlocks where we are looping through that array of unlocks on the skill and instantiating a new row to populate with information about that specific unlock. It is now going on 8:30. I've said the word unlock about 100 times in the past 5 minutes, and I'm about to go crazy, so I think I'll call it here for the morning, grab some more coffee, and prep for my meeting. We'll catch up when I'm back to work on Dauphin. Hey everyone, welcome back to Wednesday morning, just around 7:30 here. After work yesterday, as is often the case, I just needed a bit of a break, so after dinner and some family time, I ended up doing a bit of editing for this video and played some Red Dead Redemption 2, which I picked up during the winter sale and have been really enjoying. When I got back to work this morning, I started building a pattern for actually paying attention to these unlocks as you try and use a particular skill. So for our diving skill, you may recall that we have our depth 1 and depth 2 unlocks. So for level 1, we can only dive to 5 meters deep, and once we reach level 2, we'll be able to dive up to 10 meters deep. I haven't really figured out how to implement this into preventing the player from diving deeper, but I do have it hooked up to the point where if you dive down to 5 meters, which we can see on our dive monitor here, the console will start printing out that we are too deep. So that's a step in the right direction. I think there are probably a lot of ways to kind of figure out if the player has a high enough skill level to do something, but I'm happy with my first attempt at it this morning. So here within our dive state, where we are kind of polling for depth to figure out what depth the player is currently diving to, we have a new call to a function called perform depth check. And you can see just from the few lines of code here, what we're doing is actually querying the diving skill itself to retrieve the max depth. And the thought process here is that it really is, conceptually, the player's diving skill that determines how deep they should dive. So that's where I decided to place that logic. So we can go ahead and open up the diving script, which is an extension of skill. and you can see how we're actually looking at the unlocks for the specific skill to determine how deep the player can dive. The resulting code is pretty well organized this way and seems to be working. Now I just have to actually limit how deep the player can go based on this calculation. For now, time to head off to work for the day. As always, we will catch up soon. Hey everyone, welcome back to Thursday morning. Sorry we kind of skipped through yesterday. It ended up being a really productive day both at work and in the evening as I continued work on Dauphin, and I just couldn't find much opportunity to film. I put in another hour or so this morning after my workout, and I've got some pretty cool progress to show you. First, we'll take a look at some new behavior in the dive state. Now, last you saw, I was just trying to identify when the player was going below a certain depth and check that against the unlocks for the diving skill to see if they could actually go that deep. And I was successful in making that check, but I wasn't actually doing anything to prevent the player from going deeper than what their skill allows for. So in this case now, you can dive down to, we'll open up our watch face here. If we go below 5 feet, we will see a message display telling us that our current diving level prevents us from diving any deeper. And as you saw, if you actually try to swim below the 5-meter point, you will be pushed back up regardless of the input that you provide to the player. So you'll just kind of bounce off the bottom here if you try to go too much deeper. What's nice is that that little message will only show the first time in any specific dive where you try to go below what you're allowed. So it should be a gentle reminder that you need to level up your diving skill without being too annoying. My next update has to do with the process of leveling up itself. If we open up our skill page here, you can see that our conservation skill is nearly leveled up from 1 to 2. And at level 2, we have an unlock called Cave Bat, which allows us to save cave bats from corruption. So at this point, I have my little sword equipped. If we go over here and manage to find a crab, we can go ahead and attack that crab, at which point we will have gained enough experience to level up. We now have a message that pops up to tell us that we have advanced our conservation skill to level 2. If we dismiss that, we will also see a conditional message based on whether or not we have just unlocked a new unlock for that skill. In this case we have, so we're told we can now save cave bats from corruption. I'll definitely be improving the visuals of a level up more in the future to make it look at least a bit more rewarding and kind of trigger that sense of accomplishment. In the meantime, this is a great foundation for congratulating the player and informing them about new unlocks. We're creeping up on 9 a.m. here this morning, so time for me to get ready for work. I also think it's probably a good time to start wrapping up this devlog. On either Wednesday or Thursday each week, I get together with some friends online for a game night. That falls tonight, so I'll have the evening off from development. Tomorrow, I'll likely focus on editing up this video for release on Saturday. I hope you all enjoyed this slightly less structured devlog as I took you through my typical work week. It's taken me a while, but I've found that strengthening my discipline and establishing a consistent routine really helps me both make progress on my personal projects while still being able to enjoy my free time. As always, big thanks to the folks supporting this channel and Dauphin's development on Patreon, with a special shout out to my Garami supporters: Cody Odin, Finnick Fu Games, Mega Ombre, Vlad Sunny, James Kennedy, Jess Zargo, Delius, Happy Hippie, and Binary Chef. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and until the next video, stay safe.